Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Now, after we talk about these matchups in terms of receiving statistics allowed, whether it's receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns thus far this season, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Immediately to the right of me, you can already see our top 18 wide receivers for today. We'll talk about each of these players individually, then get into our 19 through 36 rankings, as I'll be sharing with you guys my opinions regarding these players going into Week 10, and of course the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I want to go ahead and of course start them, and why I believe the overall rankings within the week are going to stack up as such. Now, before we begin, of course, we're going to have two players on today's list that are going to be in the second half of the video that are currently still in question as to whether or not they're going to even play. Guys like Deebo Samuel and Keenan Allen, who are both dealing with hamstring injuries that we're not 100% certain as to whether or not they're even going to participate into this upcoming weekend's games. Now, yesterday, of course, I didn't mention a singular Indianapolis Colts running back, and the primary reason was because Jonathan Taylor still dealing with an injury. Of course, Deion Jackson left that game on Sunday with a knee injury, and we're not 100% certain who the primary back is going to be between a guy like Jordan Wilkins and or Zach Moss, or maybe even Deion Jackson is going to be healthy, or Jonathan Taylor. Therefore, I went ahead and decided opting against ranking a player like that and just waiting until later on in the week when we get more information. Now, of course, as the week progresses, tomorrow we'll talk about our quarterback and tight end rankings going into Week 10. On Friday, we'll have rest of season running back rankings. Of course, Saturday we'll be live streaming. Of course, we'll have rest of season wide receiver rankings on that day. On Sunday morning, we'll also have our rankings for Week 10 up to date for all four primary positions. On screen, we'll have our top 36 running backs, wide receivers, top 16 quarterbacks and tight ends. So if in fact we get more information as the week progresses that these players are fully practicing and healthy, of course, we can rank them accordingly. Now, if that kind of information, of course, interests you and you want to continue to get daily fantasy football content from my direction to yours, be sure to subscribe down below. Of course, we're making daily fantasy football content not only to help you win your Week 10 matchup, but of course, capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. So go ahead, subscribe today. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who are down in the description of the video, not only subscribing, but clicking the like button, again, check out Prize Picks. There's a link down in the description. If you want to play daily fantasy and have that at your fingertips every single day, whether it is playing along with the Thursday night contest between the Atlanta Falcons and Carolina Panthers, I know there's potential that there's going to be a rain game there. We might want to be taking more on a lot of those rushing statistics, specifically Dante Foreman and or Algier, Cordero Patterson, surpassing their overall rushing yards. Again, the entire purpose of Prize Picks is picking more or less on a given player's statistics, perhaps picking less on some of them passing statistics for PJ Walker and or Marcus Mariota, who we know, aren't the most capable quarterbacks, especially if the weather is going to be an impact. Either way, check that out today. Use promo code Andrew, and when you do so, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So that's something if you guys are interested in, go ahead and check it out down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, so as you can see on screen, we have our top 18 wide receiver rankings, but let's go ahead and begin by talking about some matchups at the position. Now, as you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have allowed in terms of receiving statistics, which is receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Now, of course, I've recalculated fantasy points per game based on those three statistics because, again, Deebo Samuel getting himself rushing attempts out of the backfield has nothing to do with the overall matchup. That's more of a running back category than anything else. So when we go ahead and just isolate receiving statistics, we find that the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, Atlanta Falcons and the Tennessee Titans are the three best matchups within the given week in which we always want to play our wide receivers against. Now, of course, we have Chris Olave taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, could be able to take advantage of that. Most recently, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers gave up 3 touchdowns individually just to one player by the name of A.J. Brown. Of course, there's a reason why the Pittsburgh Steelers are leading the league in terms of receiving touchdowns allowed. That secondary has obviously been hurt for majority of the season. Of course, we have the Atlanta Falcons, and there may be a little bit of a weather concern for Thursday night's game, but this could also be taken advantage of by DJ Moore, who did so just a couple weeks back, in which he put up 24 plus fantasy points in a half PPR against that secondary. Of course, the Tennessee Titans, of course, even though they weren't, giving up huge plays to Patrick Mahomes, they were still getting, carved up a little bit there. JuJu Smith-Schuster with 10 receptions. We also saw Mecole Hardman get himself a lot of work. Travis Kelce. There's a lot of, overall potential there in going ahead and carving up that secondary. We could end up seeing that this week, but Russell Wilson is a tough ask to see that from. Either way, now that we've kind of talked about this, you can go ahead and pause, check out these rankings. We'll refer back to these matchup rankings as we progress throughout today's video. As we typically do, we designate every single matchup within a 1 through 5 star rating. Of course, 5 star being the best possible matchup within the given week, and a 1 star being the worst, and potentially a wide receiver you may want to avoid. But in some circumstances, talent makes the biggest difference. Now, in the circumstance of Tyreek Hill taking on the Cleveland Browns this week, this is a matter of skill. He's in a 3-star matchup, which is pretty much middle of the pack. And what typically defines a player as to whether or not they can find success against this is their overall skill and the opportunities that they're given. And when we're talking about skill and opportunity, Tyreek Hill checks all the boxes. Thus far this season, in the first 6 games that he's played fully with Tua. Okay, now this means that Tua hasn't left early with a overall concussion or anything like that, or Skylar Thompson wasn't the starter, or Teddy Bridgewater. In the 6 games he's played with Tua, he's averaged 10.7 targets, 7.8 receptions, 120 receiving yards, 0.5 receiving touchdowns, and 19.13 half PPR fantasy points per game. He's one of the most explosive players in the National Football League, and his ability to go ahead and make plays down the field and continue to get a high volume of targets is unbelievable. Now, this offense is obviously accentuating that value that he has, and of course, alongside Waddle, which is also pulling, his own respective coverage, there is a lot of noise being made out of this Dolphins offense, and they're not slowing up anytime soon. The fact that thus far this season, Tyreek Hill currently has a yard per route run average of 3.82. That is the most ridiculous number I've ever seen. Like, quite frankly, at the end of a singular season, if the best overall wide receiver at the given year has a 2.8 yard per route run average, then we're in a good spot, right? That is a normal, really high number. 3.82 is unbelievable. In fact, in regards to all receiving options in the National Football League, he's number 1 in terms of yards per route run with 10 or more catches. Those are the eligible options. As of right now, he's not slowing up anytime soon. Should have a monster week against the Cleveland Browns secondary. Moving on to Cooper Kupp. Now, even though Cooper Kupp does struggle up against the Arizona Cardinals, most recently in the last 4 games that he's played against them, he's put up 8.9, 24.8, 14.6, and 14.4. We'll take 14-point performances. Now, in the case of Cooper Kupp in a half PPR, these aren't the most, influential performances within a given weekend. Typically, the Arizona Cardinals play well against them, whether it was earlier this season or in the 2021/2022 NFL playoffs. They played pretty well against them. They don't really let him have those explosive performances that define his season, but he's making plays. Now, over the course of this season, even though the struggles have, been pretty persistent in regards to Matthew Stafford and this offense as a whole, we've continued to see Cooper Kupp make plays, whether it's a 65-yard touchdown or a 75-yard touchdown. Doesn't really matter whether it's against the Cowboys or against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He will make a play to define his week and bring us fantasy value. Regardless of how difficult this matchup could potentially be, considering the Cardinals do give him problems, he's obviously an automatic start. Moving on to Justin Jefferson taking on the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills matchup, again, we're going to wonder whether or not Tre'Davious White is going to be active, but there's a potential that Tre'Davious White, even when he's activated, isn't going to be trailing a guy like Justin Jefferson. That is a difficult task to ask on your first game back, of course, coming off of this entire rehab process from the ACL that Tre'Davious White sustained a year ago. Now, if in fact we get into a situation where Tre'Davious White is not activated and Justin Jefferson has the privilege of taking on this secondary as it currently is, they've dealt with a lot of injuries. They're all pros across the board are no longer there. There's a lot of inexperience there in that secondary, and though they're very well coached, Justin Jefferson should be able to take advantage of this very easily. Now, thus far this season, he's accounted for nearly 42% of his team's air yards. And based on the last couple performances here, in 4 out of the last 5 games, he has surpassed 100 or more receiving yards. And in 5 out of the last 5 games, has surpassed over 98 receiving yards. So if you're going to guarantee us about 9.8 fantasy points in terms of yardage alone from Justin Jefferson's performance, of course, the receptions are going to be there, 6 or more. We just need that ever-elusive touchdown. We got it last week, but the ever-elusive touchdown is what unlocks Justin Jefferson from being a 15-point play to a 20-plus point play any given week. And hopefully, considering there's a lot of inexperience in that secondary, he'll be able to take advantage of that against Buffalo. Moving on, let's talk about another Buffalo option, specifically Stefon Diggs. Now, we've gotten word in regards to Josh Allen's elbow being a slight, sprain/tear of the UCL. Now, a full tear would have probably, forced him to have surgery, and a slight strain may potentially force him to miss some time. We're not 100% certain as to how this is going to go ahead and transpire, but we do believe that if, in fact, Josh Allen is active, Stefon Diggs is a startable option. Absolutely. Now, if we, in fact, we get into a situation where we have to trust Case Keenum as a starting quarterback, again, this is going to be a Case Keenum revenge game along with a Stefon Diggs revenge game. Both these guys have experience with one another. They played together in Minnesota. They went to the playoffs. You guys remember, that game against the New Orleans Saints, in which buzzer beater touchdown from Stefon Diggs. So they have their own experience. They have their own rapport. And even if there is a quarterback switch here, I still believe that Stefon Diggs will have a lot of value going into the week. Again, his current prize pick number is 87.5 receiving yards. I expect that number to potentially even decline as the week progresses. So if in fact you want to go ahead and take that number in terms of picking less on that, as of right now, you could. But I think that number will decline considering, yes, he's been able to accomplish that in 6 out of the last 8 weeks, and specifically in the last 4 consecutive games. But if Josh Allen's not going to be active, it's going to be tough to take that number. Now, luckily for him, he has a little bit of experience, specifically against the number 1 cornerback of the Minnesota Vikings, which currently is Patrick Peterson. Patrick Peterson, the last time he faced Stefon Diggs was in 2020. In fact, in that game, Patrick Peterson got destroyed as Stefon Diggs had himself 10 targets, 10 catches, 93 yards and a touchdown, and over 20 fantasy points. Obviously with Josh Allen, but regardless of where we end up seeing this week, I think Stefon Diggs is an automatic play. Let's move on to Davante Adams. Even though Davante Adams did get a little bit banged up in the second half and really didn't find much success there, just to give you guys some specifics, in the second half, he was targeted 8 times and had 1 of those passes completed for 0 yards. In the first half, he did all of his damage. In fact, in the second series of the game, in which the Las Vegas Raiders came out offensively, they put together a singular drive in which he was targeted 6 times and led to 6 receptions, 88 yards, and a touchdown. There was a singular drive where he had 17.8 half PPR fantasy points. We know what Davante Adams is capable of. I believe it's purely just a lack of accuracy from Derek Carr, especially in the second half of these games, not being able to put it together. And hopefully we can fix that. But going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, who of course played very well against the opposing wide receiver position thus far this season on average, we have to put into perspective that this is going to be a tough one. You're going to have to deal with Stephon Gilmore. And even though I do believe that the talent of Davante Adams is certainly far more superior than the coverage that we're going to see this upcoming weekend, it's really going to be a test for Derek Carr and being able to get the ball in his number one's direction. If the air yardage continues to be as such, 41+% going forward, I'm expecting a big week here from Davante Adams against a team like the Indianapolis Colts that could be struggling heavily offensively, which may give more and more advantages to the Raiders offense. Moving on, let's talk about the A.J. Brown effect here. Going up against the Washington Commanders. A.J. Brown in the last 3 games has been just unstoppable. I mean, truly. In the last 15 receptions, he has caught 5 receiving touchdowns. That's a 33% touchdown rate. That is unbelievable statistics that not many others in the league can say that they've accomplished. Now, going up against the Washington Commanders, again, he did it earlier this season, week 3, and put up a 17 fantasy point performance, all while in that same game, DeVonta Smith had a pop-off performance himself. In my mind, the streak of games in which A.J. Brown is putting together with Jalen Hurts, the fact that even though A.J. Brown is getting double covered and is still wide open, is unbelievable to me. You cannot slow down A.J. Brown in any sort of capacity. And by the looks of it, he's going to have himself another big week here against the Washington Commanders secondary. He's an automatic play as our number 6. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle, our number 7. Jaylen Waddle is the thumbnail for today's episode because he doesn't stop putting up great performances. That's just it. With Tua, he's been unstoppable. This season, in the 6 games that they have played together, he's averaging 8.5 targets, 6 receptions, 104 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown per game, and 19.63 fantasy points per game. He's averaging more fantasy points per game than Tyreek Hill is with Tua, which kind of gives you a little bit of perspective as to what exactly we're witnessing here in terms of the overall red zone, prowess that not only Jaylen Waddle has, but Tua having confidence to send the ball in his direction as his number 1 in those overall situations. Now, outside of those touchdowns, the receiving yard totals have been relatively successful for Jaylen Waddle this season. His numbers have consisted of 69, 171, 102, 88, 106, and 85 in the games with Tua this season. Now, currently on PrizePicks, his total receiving yard number is 70.5. That is an automatic more. We have taken more on Jaylen Waddle's receiving yards for 4 consecutive weeks here, and he's always gone over that number. He will continue to do so. That's why I continue to talk about going ahead and signing up and making a first-time deposit, because if you go ahead and make an entry with Jaylen Waddle, I think you're going to find a lot of success here. The only thing that I wanted to mention before we move on is that Jaylen Waddle could have very easily had a 77-yard receiving touchdown. Unfortunately, Tua threw the ball very short, and Waddle had to literally stop in his tracks, even though he had a 3-step advantage on the cornerback and come back for the ball. If you can go ahead and just sharpen up a couple of those overall releases from Tua, we have a wide receiver that very easily is going to be in this top 7 conversation for the rest of the way. Moving on. Let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins. Now, DeAndre Hopkins has one of the tougher matchups of the week. Even though the Los Angeles Rams overall secondary has given up their fair share of points, going up against, Jalen Ramsey has been a very contentious point for DeAndre Hopkins over his entire career. I mean, they have been matching up ever since the Houston versus Jacksonville days many years ago. So I think this is going to be very competitive between the two. It's typically been a 50-50 experience as to who ends up winning that given week and whether DeAndre Hopkins actually has a 15-point game or a 5-point game, which is definitely tough to, wonder what we can potentially see here. But I'm hoping that the overall target share that he's experienced over the last couple weeks here since returning from his suspension, 29.62%, nearly 30% of the overall targets going in his direction on a weekly basis. And the fact that the only thing that really stopped him last week was Robbie Anderson. His own teammate had a false start that had a touchdown, his second touchdown of the day called back. If that wasn't to happen, of course, we were going to have another 20-point performance from DeAndre Hopkins, who is on a hot streak as of right now. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Guys, I'm not giving up on him. I truly believe that Amon-Ra St. Brown is a difference maker, especially for the rest of the way. Now, when we're talking about target shares from, DeAndre Hopkins' overall perspective, if you look at the target shares that Amon-Ra St. Brown has experienced in the last 2 weeks, a 30.15% rate is unbelievable. If you continue to send the ball in his direction, he's going to find success, and I'm expecting that to be the case. In Week 9 against the Green Bay Packers, Amon-Ra St. Brown accounted for literally 34.6% of the offensive targets going in his direction. He accounted for 29% of the receptions and 40% of the team's passing yardage. Now, this upcoming week, of course, they take on the Chicago Bears, and he has to go up against Kyler Gordon. Kyler Gordon, as a slot cornerback of the Chicago Bears, has given up a lot of overall fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. In fact, he's given up the second most receptions in the slot, 32 total. He's given up the second most receiving yards, 374 total, and the second most receiving touchdowns in the slot, 2 total. I think this is a fantastic get-right week for not only the Detroit Lions offense, but Amon-Ra St. Brown. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb, of course, coming off the bye week, should be fresh and ready to go. The last 2 performances that we saw with him and Dak Prescott were okay. They weren't the greatest performances. Of course, one of them having a touchdown and getting 16.3 fantasy points against the Chicago Bears in Week 8. Prior to that, of course, only getting himself about 8.6 fantasy points. In terms of overall opportunity, he's gotten himself 13 total targets in the last 2 games with Dak that have led to 9 receptions, 147 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 24 fantasy points in the last 2 games. So about 12 fantasy points per game on average. Not the greatest overall, production, especially considering the offense that we're talking about. And of course, the quarterback he's associated with. But unfortunately, he doesn't see as many targets as Dalton Schultz does in this offense. In fact, in the last 2 games, the Dallas Cowboys have had 4 tight ends active in both games on their active roster. So they've wanted to use a lot of not only, 2 tight end sets, 3 tight end sets, but have an additional rotational guy that not only is going to play special teams, but could come in and make some plays. And Dalton Schultz in the last 2 games has had 12 targets and 11 receptions. He's had just as many targets as a CeeDee Lamb, but certainly more effectiveness in terms of catching the ball and making plays down the field. That, in my opinion, continues to lead me down the path of thinking it is a tougher matchup against Rasul Douglas, of course, a guy like Jair Alexander, which makes you a little bit concerned about the matchup, but we got to hope that CeeDee Lamb can put it together coming off the bye. Moving on to Mike Evans, our number 11, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks secondary has played extremely well, but quite frankly, it's Mike Evans. And when he's given the amount of opportunity that he is, he will be able to deliver. In the last 3 games, he has had 36 total targets. And yes, those 36 total targets have really only led to 20 receptions, but there have been a handful of different defensive pass interference calls, handful of drops which could have been made to either touchdowns and or big yardage plays for Mike Evans that I'm sure he wants back. As of right now, amongst all receivers in the league, he's number 5 in terms of total air yards, 888 going in his direction within his offense. The yardage is going to come. The touchdowns are eventually going to be there. And quite frankly, the fact that we haven't seen a touchdown in, 5 games now? That is the longest streak that Mike Evans has ever experienced in his entire career since 2017, in which he hasn't scored a touchdown. 5 games is a long time. And I certainly believe Mike Evans getting down into the red zone will be able to score a touchdown this week and get right. Could have very easily had a touchdown last week. Of course, defensive pass interference is a common thing called when Mike Evans is going up for a big play. Moving on to DK Metcalf on the other end of this matchup in Germany this weekend. We have DK Metcalf taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. DK Metcalf's consecutive weeks of scoring a touchdown. Of course, coming off of just a couple weeks ago, he had to leave the game due to a knee injury, and now he's just perfectly fine. That's why I call him the Terminator. That's why I've given him that nickname just a couple years ago, and I'll continue to ride with that. As of right now, his overall red zone utilization is the biggest difference maker on him having a great week and him having an average to below average performance. Now, the fact that currently, amongst all receiving options in the National Football League, he's number 5 in terms of red zone targets. He's had 13 in the red zone. That is a beautiful option. if you continue to get Geno Smith in this very effective offense that is going to move the ball on Tampa Bay, don't get it wrong, they're going to move the ball on Tampa Bay, but if they can get it down into the red zone, we're absolutely going to be looking in the direction of DK Metcalf to continue to make these plays. Now, to go ahead and backtrack a little bit here, last Wednesday, I had him as a number 24 ranked receiver within the given week. By the time we got to Sunday, I had moved him back into my top 16 conversation because I had a feeling that he was going to score against the Arizona Cardinals defense. And by all means, he did. There's just a thing about DK Metcalf where, yes, in some circumstances, he's going to have bad performances. When we talk about Jamel Dean, the starting number one cornerback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it isn't the easiest matchup, but typically he finds success in the toughest of matchups. Moving on, let's talk about our number 13 going into this week. We have Chris Olave. Now, like we mentioned before, the Pittsburgh Steelers give up the most points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. Now, of course, Chris Olave is coming off of a couple good performances here, but with Andy Dalton thus far this season, in the 5 games that they've played together between weeks 4 through 9, we have seen a 27.21% target share go in the direction of Chris Olave, which is relatively strong, averaging about 8.6 targets, 5.2 receptions, 70 receiving yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 12 fantasy points per game throughout that 5-game stretch. Overall, a fantastic option, and because of the matchup that we have on hand here, he should be even better in my mind. Considering, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers combined for 13 catches, 236 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns against Pittsburgh. But that doesn't stop there. Miami, 14 catches, 204 yards. Tampa Bay, 12 catches, 157. Buffalo, 18 catches, 389, and 4 touchdowns. The wide receiver position has certainly been able to take advantage of this matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And considering Michael Thomas is out for the season, Jarvis Landry cannot get healthy due to the ankle, Olave is going to continue to be the number one option. Moving on to JuJu Smith-Schuster. JuJu Smith-Schuster has somehow, some way, really turned it around. Now, in the preseason, I had a lot of hopes for JuJu. He came out and was, hot to start, but then pretty much fizzled out. But the chemistry has begun to build, whether it's them playing Warzone during the bye week or whether it's just them at practice, getting a better feel for one another. Him and Patrick Mahomes have been perfect in the last 3 weeks. In fact, he's averaging 8.3 targets, 7.3 catches, 108 receiving yards, 0.67 receiving touchdowns, and 18.5 half PPR fantasy points per week since week 6. That level of production is unbelievable, especially in the case of JuJu, who has primarily been a slot receiver his entire career or has excelled in that slot role, but has now moved out wide in a lot of circumstances and still finding success. In the last 3 weeks, he had 22 total receptions. From weeks 1 through 5, he had 22 total receptions. The overall opportunity he is being given is unbelievable. Currently on PrizePicks, his total receiving yard number, more or less, is 57.5. I think this is an automatic more, considering he's been able to accomplish that in 5 out of the last 8 games this season. Let's move on to our number 15, Amari Cooper. Now, someone brought it to my attention just the other day, I think it was on Monday night during the live stream, that Amari Cooper does not play well away from home. In fact, his overall statistics in those 3 away games have been 14 targets, 7 catches, 100 yards, and 13.5 fantasy points. So pretty much a 4-point per game average away. Now, this week they play away in Miami. So if you're thinking that you can trust those splits in terms of home versus away, then maybe go ahead and take that 61.5 receiving yard number and pick less going into this week if you think that he's not going to play well. But I purely do believe it's a matter of matchup more than anything in those away games. Now, going up against the Miami Dolphins secondary, which has been absolutely torn apart by offenses in the last couple of weeks. I mean, when Justin Fields is completing 3 passing touchdowns against you, that gives you a little bit of an indication as to what we're dealing with here. There is a lot of potential here for Amari Cooper, and coming off the bye week, I expect them to be ready for the Miami Dolphins secondary. A defense that, quite frankly, for the entirety of last year, Jacoby Brissett had a privilege of playing against. As a second-string quarterback of that offense last year, for majority of the season, he was a scout team quarterback, and he was lighting up that defense at practice, I can assure you. And I think Jacoby Brissett will be able to put together a good performance here. Since week 2, we have seen Amari Cooper put up 10 or more fantasy points in 6 out of the last 8 games. If, in fact, we're just going to lean in the direction where we're going to have another one of these dud performances, by all means, I'm willing to take the risk on this home versus away, conversation. But as of right now, I think the matchup is far too advantageous to be able to not start him within the given week. Let's move on to Christian Kirk taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. When Christian Kirk is given opportunity, it has typically led to success. 9 targets, 8 catches, 76 yards, scored a touchdown against the Las Vegas Raiders, now has to take on the Kansas City Chiefs. And their slot number 1 cornerback is L'Jarius Sneed. And he's played extremely well in terms of coverage, but he's given up his fair share of stats. 30 total targets, led to 24 receptions, 185 receiving yards. But across the league, that is not, the best overall numbers for a wide receiver taking on a respective cornerback. I think this is going to be a tougher matchup. but it's all about opportunity for Christian Kirk. If he is given opportunity, he's going to produce. In the 5 games this season where he has had 6 or more receptions, he's always scoring double-digit fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And in those games, he's always surpassed 72 receiving yards. Get him the ball, get it in his hands, he will be able to produce. I have no doubt about it in my mind. Moving on to Tyler Lockett, our number 17. Tyler Lockett, he's just been far too consistent. 6 out of the last 8 games, 10 or more fantasy points. It's far too efficient in my mind to not have him in my starting lineup every single week. He's just been one of the best wide receivers. There's a reason why he's in the top 10 in terms of fantasy points, in terms of the wide receiver position this season. And there's been a lot of touchdowns he could have had that he's either dropped or stepped out of bounds, or, penalties that sometimes are called, sometimes aren't. This last week benefited from the fact that he obviously had an offensive PI against this, the guy that was covering him. Nobody called it. Beautiful, we'll take that. But in some circumstances, it's going to be tough. Now, when I went ahead and looked at his overall route chart this last weekend, everything that he's running is typically 10 or more yards down the field. He is very rarely catching the ball within the 0 to 9 yard range of a short range reception. It is all down the field. And specifically, when we haven't seen him play in the slot very much this year, he's being utilized a lot out wide. We're going to continue to expect big playability from Tyler Lockett, considering his speed and, of course, Geno Smith's ability to send the ball downfield and find a lot of success. I'm expecting them to do so against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Germany this week. Moving on to the final option within our top 18, we have Allen Lazard. Allen Lazard is a touchdown machine. In the 6 healthy games that he has played this season, he has scored 5 total touchdowns. We can't ask for anything more than that. The yardage is going to continue to be there. And like we predicted in the offseason, he's going to be the number 1 of Aaron Rodgers for the remainder of this season. With Romeo Doubs going down with an injury, Aaron Jones still dealing with that ankle injury, Randall Cobb still on the IR, Sammy Watkins still very old, there really isn't anyone else to throw the ball to. There are going to be some inexperienced rookies that will get a couple opportunities here and there, whether it's Christian Watson or whoever the heck else wants to step up, but it's going to be all Allen Lazard all day. We've seen that over the last couple weeks when Randall Cobb has been out. In the last 4 consecutive games where, of course, Allen Lazard has been healthy and playing, he's gotten himself 4+ receptions in every single one of those games. Very easily could have had himself a second touchdown this last weekend if it wasn't for the helmet ricochet that led to an interception. As of thus far this season, inside the 10-yard line, he's the number 5 overall receiving option in terms of receiving touchdowns within that range, having 3. Could have had himself 4, but hopefully he'll be able to recover from that going into this week and scoring against the Dallas Cowboys. All right, let's move on. All right, so as you can see on screen, we have our number 19 through 36 ranked wide receivers. Of course, we have Deebo Samuel, number 19, Keenan Allen, number 31. I mentioned them earlier on in today's episode in regards to guys that, again, we're not 100% certain on as to whether or not they're going to be healthy going into this week, but just giving you guys a little bit of perspective visually as to where we're going to transition here. If in fact you're deciding between guys like a Darnell Mooney or a Curtis Samuel, you'll know where to go based on the visual representation here. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change as the week progresses and injuries develop. Practice reports come out, whether it's offensive or defensive. These are all variables that we take into account. That's why on Sunday mornings from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I always live stream with updated rankings on screen. Not only help you set your lineups, but help you win your matchups and get us one step closer to winning a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. So be sure to join us, subscribe today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about our number 19, Deebo Samuel, taking on the LA Chargers. If in fact the hamstring injury is behind him, and that bye week certainly helped, we're going to be in a position where Deebo Samuel is back to scoring 12+ fantasy points per week. Because when you look at weeks 3 through 7, when there has been no Trey Lance within this offense and Jimmy Garoppolo has started, in those weeks, Deebo Samuel is averaging 8.2 targets, 5 catches, 66 receiving yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 12.14 fantasy points per game. Now, if in fact we're going to get some sort of limited capacity from Deebo Samuel, which is why I'm, kind of ranking him at number 19, if we're going to see some sort of limited capacity because they don't need to utilize him. When you have McCaffrey, Elijah Mitchell potentially returning, you have Brandon Aiyuk playing out of his mind, George Kittle, you don't always have to throw the ball in the direction of Deebo Samuel. So they don't have to force him back. And because of that, I rank him a little bit lower, but we'll see how the week progresses in terms of his practice utilization and our participation. Moving on, let's talk about Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is a target machine. From week 6 through 9, he has had himself a total of 46 targets in 4 games. 26 catches on those 46 targets, relatively underwhelming. 249 yards and 38.2 fantasy points and a half PPR. So a little bit less than 10 fantasy points per game when it should have been significantly more. But to be honest, his low catch rate isn't because, he's dropping passes or he's not able to make the play because of his ACL just not being fully there. It's mainly because Tom Brady sucks. That's what it is. When you go ahead and look at the deemed catchable passes in terms of the statistics regarding those 46 total targets, only 28 of them were considered catchable. One of them was a drop. Even though I'd love to look at that 46 target number in the last 4 games and say we can 1000% trust him, in a half PPR scoring format, it is extremely tough to do so, considering thus far this season, amongst all wide receiver options, he's literally the 8th lowest ranked wide receiver in terms of ADOT. Average depth of target, only 6.0 yards down the field per total target. That is a ridiculously low number. And quite frankly, the fact that he only has a 5.0, yard after the catch per reception rate is very concerning as well. So the fact that he's not able to get many targets down the field to where he's getting incredible chunks of yardage, and the fact that even after the catch, he's not making huge plays, very concerning for his overall upside. Therefore, in a full PPR, a little bit higher ranked, but in a half PPR, with touchdown dependency, it's tough to trust him. Moving on, let's talk about Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney has played well over the last couple weeks, of course. This last week scored his first touchdown of the season. And now he has an incredible matchup against the secondary of the Detroit Lions, who last year he tore apart, putting up 16.0 and 15.0 fantasy points. I think that this transition that this offense has seen, the ability to allow Justin Fields to make plays out of the pocket, whether it's scrambling or throwing the ball, will continue to lead to this offense succeeding. And if they're going to continue to get down into the red zone, Darnell Mooney is far too talented, and we knew this in the offseason, far too talented to be denied. Now, if it wasn't for Aaron Rodgers, throwing a couple misguided passes, couple ricocheted passes, he would have thrown for 3 passing touchdowns against that secondary. I very easily believe that Darnell Mooney is going to get his targets. Whether he finds the end zone is a completely different conversation. But if the targets are there, specifically against the Detroit Lions secondary, the yardage is going to be enough to carry his week. Let's move on to Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk has been unbelievable. In the last 3 games, he's averaged 9.3 targets, 7.0 receptions, 82 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown per game. That's 17.7 fantasy points per game in the last 3 contests he's put forth. And with Jimmy G this year, he is averaging 12.92. Overall, when we're talking about the matchup against the LA Chargers, even though it isn't the greatest matchup within the given week, if Deebo Samuel is in any sort of position to be a little bit limited, Brandon Aiyuk's utilization within this offense and his connection with Jimmy Garoppolo, picking up exactly where it left off in 2021, is going to continue the momentum of being a weekly starter as a wide receiver to play as my number 22. Moving on, let's talk about Josh Palmer. Josh Palmer getting 10 targets is an incredible number across the board. 10 targets is no joke. But again, that had to do with the fact that there was no Mike Williams, no Keenan Allen, no Donald Parham, and DeAndre Carter was limited in some sort of capacities. But across the board, being able to catch the ball on 10 total targets 8 times is a pretty good number. Now, unfortunately, one of those total targets led to an interception as it literally ricocheted off of his hands into a defender's hands, but it is what it is. A lot of the receptions that Josh Palmer made were relatively close to the line of scrimmage, and that's what we've continued to see from this offense. They are not really throwing it deep, and that's not what we're going to expect from Josh Palmer. He'll make plays down the seam, but ultimately, if he's going to catch the ball 6 times, at most, each reception is going to get him about 10 yards. So he really is going to be dependent on a touchdown, especially going up against the San Francisco 49ers, to have an extremely high upside play, because we know that Ward and Lenore, their primary outside corners, are playing extremely well this season. Now, there have been performances like, Cooper Kupp recently, 8 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown. The Kansas City wide receivers completely torching this defense. But when we're talking about Justin Herbert, the way that this offense has looked, their inability to stay healthy this year, it is difficult to see Josh Palmer having an explosive week, but a stable week is certainly in store for us. Moving on to Terry McLaurin, number 24. Terry McLaurin, in the last 3 games that he has played with Taylor Heineke as a starting quarterback, has been relatively active. 8.33 targets per game, 5.33 receptions, nearly 81 receiving yards per game, and 0.33 receiving touchdowns per game, all for 12.5 fantasy points per game. Now, earlier this year, he took on the Philadelphia Eagles in week 3. He put up 13.2 fantasy points as he had over 100 receiving yards against Darius Slayton and obviously put together a great performance. Now, if in fact we're going to see ourselves a conversation where the Philadelphia Eagles defense continues to struggle as the season progresses, of course, last week giving up 2 passing touchdowns from Davis Mills, if we go ahead and see Terry McLaurin step into this role against a secondary that he's very familiar with, of course, being a division rival, he should very easily be able to come out of this week with a great performance. In terms of yardage and receptions, whether that touchdown connects is a completely different conversation. Moving on, let's talk about DeVonta Smith. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, now, DeVonta Smith has been witnessing on the other side of the field, A.J. Brown score 5 touchdowns in the last 3 games. And I'm sure he's feeling a little bit jealous, but in the last 3 games, he's had himself a decent amount of opportunity, but in terms of receiving yards, just really hasn't been much. 44, 23, and 22. Those are not numbers that we can hang our hat on, especially considering we know what DeVonta Smith is capable of. I mean, the last time he took on the Washington Commanders in week 3, 12 targets, 8 catches, 169 and a touchdown for 26.9 fantasy points. We're hoping for an explosive week like this, but we can't guarantee it, especially considering his average depth of target, his overall reception count, his target utilization has been continuously dropping in the last 3 weeks here, which is very concerning, especially as A.J. Brown continues to build momentum on the other side of the field. And even though he's double covered, getting a lot of targets. Moving on to Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman is in a position where, of course, we're wanting to start him because he has been able to score touchdowns in each of the last 3 games that he has played. But even though he's been able to do that for the last 3 weeks, it doesn't guarantee his future success. Now, he's coming off of a week in which he had 6 catches on 9 targets, 79 receiving yards, and a touchdown. That receiving touchdown out of the backfield down in the red zone. In fact, I wanted to specify how much utilization he is getting down in the red zone and why it's so important. In the last couple weeks here, from weeks 5 through 9, he's had 20 total touches. In those 20 total touches, he has scored 5 touchdowns. So 25% of the touches he's getting, he's scoring a touchdown. But specifically, 3 of those touchdowns through the air and 2 of them on the ground. Now, when you get inside the 10-yard line, all of his touchdowns are accompanied within that range in the red zone. Of course, a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of utilization out of the backfield in which it's either being handed off to him or tossed to him forward to go ahead, make a play, and just beat people to the edge because his speed is far too deadly. So the way that I'm thinking about it, with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Isaiah Pacheco, Jerick McKinnon not really being utilized down in the red zone in any sort of capacity, Mecole Hardman's role is really not going away. We just need him to score a touchdown to be relevant every given week. Moving on to DJ Moore. Considering the weather in Carolina this week is going to be rough and they have a Thursday night matchup, I'm extremely concerned about the passing game here for PJ Walker. PJ Walker obviously just got replaced in the first half of that game against the Cincinnati Bengals, in which he really didn't do anything in that first half. I think it was 3 for 11. Second half, here comes Baker, was able to at least salvage himself a week there. But just a couple weeks ago against Atlanta, we saw DJ Moore put together a 24.5 point performance. I don't know if we're going to see 11 targets, 6 catches, 152 and a touchdown against this defense if in fact the weather is going to be, unsustainable for the passing game. If it's going to be, as we're expecting, a 70% chance of rain, and it's going to be, 10 to 12 mile per hour winds, and with that, makes me a little bit concerned about the potential play of DJ Moore, despite how incredible the matchup is. Moving on to Jerry Jeudy taking on the Tennessee Titans. Jerry Jeudy has had 5 consecutive games this season of 50 or more receiving yards. That in itself already gives me a pretty good idea in terms of playing him via Prize Picks this week. Now, the reason why I'm so confident in doing so is because the Tennessee Titans secondary has struggled a lot this season. Most recently, against the Kansas City Chiefs, 21 receptions, 228 receiving yards and a touchdown. Indianapolis even succeeded against them. 19 receptions, 165 and a touchdown. Washington, 14 for 250 and 2. Indianapolis, again, 13 catches, 172. Las Vegas, 14 catches, 206 and a touchdown. Buffalo, 17 catches, 251, 3 touchdowns. And even in week one, against the New York Giants, 10 catches, 157 and a touchdown. Wide receivers continue to succeed against his defense, and I don't think they're slowing down anytime soon. Outside of Greg Dulcich this week, Jerry Jeudy is the only other member of this offense that I trust going into the matchup. Let's just hope they perform. Moving on, Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore has been relatively consistent since joining this team back from his hamstring injury. In 4 out of his last 6 games, he has had 8 or more targets. He's been able to put up 9.6, 7.9, 19.9, and 10.9 fantasy points. Now, he has the privilege of taking on the LA Rams, and while DeAndre Hopkins is going to be double covered for the majority of the game, they'll be trying to stop the run against James Conner. Zach Ertz is going to get his here and there, but ultimately, it's going to be a conversation as to whether or not Rondale Moore can make plays. When we go back to week 3, when these two teams met, Greg Dortch had 10 targets, 8 catches for 90 yards against the LA Rams defense. I expect very similar numbers, hopefully, for Rondale Moore. That, in my mind, would be his upside performance within the given week. But if we're able to just get ourselves a couple catches for 60-plus yards, we're in a good overall position considering what we're talking about here. We're talking about the 3rd or 4th receiving option within this offense that could very easily step up and make a breakout performance against a tougher defense. This all being said, it's going to be a matter of whether or not Rondale Moore can make plays after the catch. This season, he has 320 receiving yards. 251 of those receiving yards are after the catch. So if, in fact, he's making plays after the catch, we're in a good position. If not, the LA Rams could be able to shut him down, but we're hoping that's not going to be the case. Moving on, let's talk about Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson this season has the 5th most targets amongst all wide receivers. He has 76 total, but when we go ahead and look at how many of those total targets have been deemed catchable, that totals to 47 of the 76 total targets sent in his direction. So obviously, even though he's getting a huge volume of targets, if they're not catchable passes, then we really can't blame him. it's not on Diontae Johnson to throw the ball to himself so that he can catch it. It's a matter of whether or not that quarterback is capable of doing so. And if Kenny Pickett doesn't come out of this bye week looking good, especially against the New Orleans Saints secondary, which really hasn't played well this year, and Marshawn Lattimore doesn't have a timeline in terms of returning from his injury, I think Diontae Johnson could have himself a big performance here, but it's all on the quarterback play. I mean, this season alone, Diontae Johnson only has 88 yards after the catch. He is typically a catch and fall kind of guy. If we're going to go ahead and get him the targets he needs, it's got to be on the moneymaker. It's literally got to be super accurate. Otherwise, Diontae Johnson's not going to be able to make enough plays to be fantasy relevant once again. Moving on to Keenan Allen. Again, Keenan Allen is going to benefit mainly because Justin Herbert has struggled this year. Justin Herbert does not throw the ball down the field. Justin Herbert this season has thrown the ball 20 or more yards down the field 35 times. He's thrown the ball between 10 to 19 yards 53 total times. He has thrown the ball behind the line of scrimmage 63 times. And for majority of his attempts, 51%, has been from 0 to 9 yards. 168 passing attempts in that overall position. I mean, just looking at last week, his performance against the Atlanta Falcons secondary, which again was one of the best matchups in the week, only allowed him to throw the ball 8 times down the field past the 10-yard line. That is an unbelievably low number. Only 8 times 10 or more yards down the field. That itself is just ridiculous to me. And obviously, it's mainly has to do with Joe Lombardi, the offensive coordinator of this team, and not letting him let the ball rip. And I don't blame him, but if Keenan Allen comes back, he easily steps up into this role and catches a boatload of passes in terms of how this offense is currently functioning. Moving on to Gabriel Davis. I don't trust Gabriel Davis without Josh Allen and his 70-yard bombs. Of course, he could have caught that 70-yard bomb at the end of the game. Unfortunately, wasn't able to do so. But if Josh Allen is not there, ripping it down the field, I don't think Case Keenum is going to be able to accentuate the skills of Gabriel Davis, mainly being a wide receiver that makes plays down the field, 20 or more yards. I don't think we're going to be able to see much success, and we'll get another one of these volatile weeks. Again, the volatility that he already exists with Josh Allen is tough, much less with another quarterback, which will make it even more difficult to potentially start him. Moving on to Adam Thielen. We mentioned it last week. The number one player that was specifically going to be hindered by the TJ Hawkinson addition was Adam Thielen. And I didn't expect it to happen so quickly, but TJ Hawkinson comes in 9 targets, 9 catches, 70 receiving yards. And yes, they have a great matchup up against this Buffalo secondary that may be, a little bit underwhelming considering they don't have Tre'Davious White, they don't have Poyer, they don't have Micah Hyde this season. There are a lot of missing pieces here. They brought in Marlowe via the trade deadline a couple days ago, but I really do not think that that's going to make the biggest difference. I think Adam Thielen could have himself a good week here, but it's all going to be dependent on whether or not TJ Hawkinson has another blow-up game. Moving on to George Pickens. Now, as the weeks have progressed, with Kenny Pickett, he's getting more and more targets. And as that continues to grow, that relationship between the two and the chemistry, we're going to eventually see George Pickens really start to unleash himself. Now, whether that's this week is a completely different conversation, but in my mind, I think to myself, all right, if Chase Claypool is going to be missing in this lineup, and all those slot targets are going to go in the direction of Pat Freiermuth, is that really going to elevate the play of George Pickens? I say probably not. So unless George Pickens is going to be able to score a touchdown, I think he probably gets himself 8 targets, 6 catches, 40 yards, and that's where he ends his week, legitimately. That's where I think his baseline of production is, and hopefully he can get past that. But I don't think Claypool's absence increases his value in any sort of capacity, even though we would like it to. Moving on to Curtis Samuel. If it wasn't for the fact that the referee down the middle of the field quite literally tackled the opposing Vikings safety to allow Curtis Samuel to score a touchdown, he would have had himself a null and void week. But luckily, he scores a touchdown. In the last 3 games, he's averaging about 24 rushing yards per game, and he's coming off of a performance against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 3 in which he had 7 catches on 10 targets for 48 yards. I purely do believe that Curtis Samuel should get more utilization within this offense. Hopefully, Taylor Heineke can kind of step up and allow that. But it's purely going to be a matter of that game script and whether or not we're able to get the ball down the field to him at a consistent rate. Let's move on to the final option. It is Donovan Peoples-Jones. I mentioned him on the waiver wire episode for the last 12 weeks in a row. And quite frankly, it's purely just a matter of consistency. Donovan Peoples-Jones from weeks 4 through 8 has been the number 32, 48, 33, 31, and 30 overall wide receiver, putting up 9.6, 7.0, 9.6, 8.1, and 10.1 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. From weeks 4 through 8, he's been the number 34 overall wide receiver. I expect him to finish within the top 36 this week against Miami's relatively underwhelming secondary and have himself a great performance. And that's pretty much going to cover it for me. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you like today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. Comment down below. Are there any wide receivers that you believe are, kind of ranked lower than they should be? Perhaps overranked based on their recent contributions? Do you believe there are some guys that are missing on today's list that should be mentioned as potential top 36 options going into week 10? If so, let me know down in the comment section. We'll have a conversation regarding that. Otherwise, tomorrow we'll talk about our tight end and quarterback rankings. Of course, tomorrow night after the Thursday Night Football game, we will, of course, be live streaming here on the channel if you have any questions. Friday, we have rest of season running back rankings. Saturday, rest of season wide receiver rankings, along with a live stream in the afternoon. And, of course, we have Sunday morning rankings. So go ahead, subscribe to the channel. Join us as we are trying to help you win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. And until next time, guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys. Peace.